I never considered myself superstitious, but after what happened in the Blackridge National Forest, I can't look at tree carvings the same way. What started as a 3-day camping trip with my best friends turned into something that still haunts my dreams, especially when I think about those symbols and the lights that surrounded us that night. It began on a crisp October morning when Jamie, Marcus, and I parked at the Blackridge Trailhead. We'd been planning this trip for months, a guy's weekend away from our desk jobs and responsibilities. The weather forecast promised clear skies, and the fall colors were at their peak. Perfect camping conditions, or so we thought. The first strange marking caught my eye about 2 miles into our hike. At first, I barely noticed it. Just a crude geometric shape carved into a birch tree. It looked fresh. The exposed would still pale against the bark. Marcus joked that some teenager probably got bored on the trail, but something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the usual heart with initials or "John was here" stuff you typically see. This was different, all sharp angles and intersecting lines, like some kind of primitive compass rose. We pushed deeper into the forest, following the trail as it wound through dense stands of maple and oak. That's when Jamie pointed out another carving, identical to the first but larger. This one couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Small bits of bark still clung to the fresh cuts. "Guys, check this out," I called out, running my fingers over the symbol. The wood's still damp. Someone was just here. Marcus shrugged it off, but I noticed him scanning the trees more carefully as we walked. The symbols kept appearing, each one slightly different from the last, but all sharing the same basic geometric pattern. They were getting bigger, too, and more elaborate. Some had additional marks that looked almost like tally marks running alongside them. By late afternoon, we had covered about 8 miles and found a decent camping spot near a small stream. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrels rustling through the leaves. Just the sound of the stream and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. "Hey! Come look at this," Jamie called from the edge of our campsite. He was staring at a massive oak tree, his headlamp illuminating yet another carving. But this one was different. The symbol was huge, covering almost the entire trunk, and the cuts were still seeping sap. Beneath it were 3 horizontal lines. 3 lines, 3 of us," Marcus muttered, finally showing signs of concern. Maybe we should find another spot. But darkness was settling in fast, and we were miles from the nearest alternative campsite. We decided to stay put, but agreed to take turns keeping watch through the night. I took first shift while the others tried to sleep. The fire cast dancing shadows through the trees as I sat there, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard it, a distinct sound of metal scraping against wood, somewhere in the darkness beyond our campfire's light. I grabbed my flashlight, but hesitated to shine it into the woods, suddenly afraid of what I might see. The scraping continued, moving from tree to tree, circling our camp. I woke Marcus and Jamie, and we huddled together, listening to whoever, or whatever, was out there, methodically marking the trees around us. That's when we saw the first light, a faint glow between the trees to the north. Then another appeared to the east, and another to the west. They were flashlights, moving steadily toward our position. I counted at least 6, maybe more, all converging on our location with deliberate precision. "We need to get out of here," Jamie whispered, already stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack. Marcus grabbed his phone, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. The lights were getting closer, and now we could hear footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves, movement from multiple directions. We abandoned most of our gear, grabbing only our backpacks and water. Jamie suggested the stream. It was our best chance to throw off whoever was following us. We killed our flashlights and moved as quietly as possible through the shallow water, using the ambient moonlight to guide us downstream. Behind us, light swept through our abandoned campsite. I heard voices, too low to make out words, but the tone was purposeful, coordinated. These weren't random hikers or forest rangers. We pushed on through the night, soaked and shivering, staying in the stream for nearly 2 miles before finally climbing onto the bank. By some miracle, we recognized a trail marker in the pre-dawn light. We were less than a mile from the parking lot. The sun was just rising when we finally reached my car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. 3 figures standing at the tree line, watching us leave. Each held something that glinted in the early morning light. What looked like long, curved knives used for carving wood. We reported everything to the park rangers, who said they'd investigate. They called us a week later, saying they'd found our abandoned campsite and numerous carved trees, but no evidence of who might have been responsible. They did mention that several hikers had gone missing in those woods over the past few years, but there was never enough evidence to connect the disappearances. I still go camping occasionally, but never in Blackridge. Sometimes I dream about those symbols and wonder what they meant, if they were marking us, tracking us, or warning us. But mostly, I try not to think about what might have happened if we'd stayed in that camp just a few minutes longer, waiting to see who was holding those lights. The thing that terrifies me most? Last week, I noticed a familiar geometric symbol carved into a tree outside my apartment building. Below it were 3 horizontal lines, just like that night. I'm moving next month, as far from any forest as I can get. Some trails are better left untraveled. Some mysteries better left unsolved. It wasn't finding our tent ransacked that terrified us. It was discovering those Polaroids. Even now, months later, the image of Kate and me sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the photographer standing over us, makes my hands shake. But I should start at the beginning, back when we thought we were just 2 friends on a peaceful camping trip in the Ozarks. Kate and I had been planning this weekend getaway for months. Both of us needed an escape from our corporate jobs in St. Louis, and the Buffalo National River seemed perfect, remote enough to feel like a real adventure, but not so isolated that we'd be completely cut off from civilization. At least, that's what we thought. The first day was exactly what we needed. We hiked 6 miles to our camping spot, a beautiful clearing near one of the river bends. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves had just started to turn. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and spent the evening sharing stories over instant coffee and trail mix. Everything felt perfect. The trouble started on our second day. We'd planned a day hike to nearby Indian Creek Falls, about 3 miles from our campsite. We secured everything in the tent, double-checked the zippers, and headed out around 9 in the morning. The hike was gorgeous. We spent hours taking photos and exploring small caves along the creek. When we returned to camp around 4, something fell off before I even opened the tent. Maybe it was the way the zipper moved too smoothly, or how the rain flies seemed slightly askew. Kate noticed it too. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "Did we leave it like that?" Inside, everything had been methodically searched. Not ransacked or stolen searched. Our sleeping bags were neatly refolded, but not quite the same way we'd left them. Our backpacks sat in slightly different positions. Even our clothes had been carefully examined and replaced, but with such precision that if we hadn't been paying attention, we might not have noticed. "Should we call the rangers?" Kate asked, her voice shaking slightly. I pulled out my phone, no service. Of course, we were too far from any towers, and our satellite communicator was still in my backpack. I dug through my pack, hands trembling slightly, and found the device exactly where I'd left it. But when I turned it on, the screen remained dark. Opening the battery compartment revealed why. The batteries had been removed and replaced backward. "We need to leave," I said, already starting to pack up our gear. But Kate grabbed my arm, pointing to something tucked into the corner of the tent. A small paper square that definitely hadn't been there that morning. It was a Polaroid photograph. The image showed our campsite from the tree line, clearly taken that morning as we were leaving for our hike. In the photo, I was adjusting my bootlaces while Kate consulted the trail map. The angle suggested the photographer had been crouching in the bushes, no more than 30 feet away. We found 2 more photos as we frantically packed up our gear. One showed us at our campfire the previous night, laughing over some forgotten joke. The other made my blood run cold. It was taken inside our tent, showing both of us sound asleep. The photographer had been standing right over us. The sound of a twig snapping in the woods made us both freeze. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Another crack, closer this time, followed by the distinct mechanical whir of a Polaroid camera. We left everything except our essential gear and water, moving as quickly and quietly as we could back toward the trail. The forest felt different now. Every shadow could be hiding someone. Every rustle of leaves could be footsteps. About a mile down the trail, we heard it. The soft click of a camera shutter, followed by that unmistakable whirring sound. It came from somewhere to our left, deeper in the woods. We broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth. The sun was almost gone now, and we had 4 miles to go before reaching the parking area. Our flashlights cast jumping shadows as we half ran, half stumbled down the trail. Every few minutes, we'd hear that click and whir, sometimes from one side of the trail, sometimes from the other. Our stalker was paralleling our movement, staying just out of sight in the darkness. We finally reached the parking lot around 10 o'clock. As we drove away, our headlights swept across the tree line, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing there. They raised their hand in a wave, and the flash of a camera lit up the darkness. The Rangers found our abandoned campsite the next day. Along with our left-behind gear, they discovered dozens of Polaroids scattered around the tent. Photos of other campers, all taken while they slept. Some of the photos dated back months. They never caught the photographer. A week later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address, just my name written in precise handwriting. Inside was a single Polaroid Kate and me in her car that night, illuminated by the camera flash as we fled the parking lot. On the white space below the image, written in the same careful handwriting, "See you next time." I haven't been camping since then. Kate moved to Colorado last month, saying she needed a fresh start. Sometimes I think about all those other campers in the photos, wondering if they know how vulnerable they were, sleeping peacefully while a stranger stood over them with a camera. Most of all, I wonder about that promise. See you next time. Yesterday, I found a Polaroid camera in my mailbox. It was empty, but a note attached read, "Your turn." I threw it away immediately, but when I got home, it was sitting on my kitchen counter. I live alone and all my doors were locked. Tonight, I keep hearing that familiar whirring sound outside my bedroom window, but I'm too afraid to look. I used to think waking up to your campsite rearranged was the scariest thing that could happen in the wilderness. I was wrong. It's watching your mysterious visitor get bolder each night, knowing that eventually they'll work up the courage to come inside. By the 3rd night, when I heard that zipper slowly sliding up, I realized how naive I'd been about the true horrors of camping alone. The Appalachian Trail had been my escape plan after my divorce. Just me, my gear, and 2 weeks of solitude to clear my head. I'd done enough weekend trips to feel confident about solo camping, and the early October weather was perfect for a longer trek. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed: peaceful hiking, quiet evenings with my journal, and that profound solitude that only the mountains can provide. I set up camp on the 3rd day near a small clearing, about a quarter mile off the main trail. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground, a babbling creek nearby, and enough tree coverage to block the wind. I secured my food in a bare canister, hung it properly away from my tent, and settled in for what I thought would be another peaceful night. The first sign that something was wrong came at dawn. My camp stove, which I'd left outside the tent vestibule, had been moved to a nearby log, not knocked over by an animal, deliberately placed. My hiking boots, normally left under the vestibule, were neatly arranged by the fire pit, laces carefully tied. My camp chair, which I distinctly remembered leaving folded against a tree, was set up facing my tent. I told myself it was just another hiker playing a prank. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought and had arranged things differently than I remembered. But deep down, I knew someone had visited my camp while I slept. That day, I hiked further than planned, wanting to put distance between myself and the previous site. I found a new spot just before dusk, this time choosing a location with clear sightlines in all directions. I was extra careful setting up camp, creating subtle markers that would show if anything was disturbed, a twig balanced on my boots, my hiking poles crossed at a specific angle. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every snapping branch jolted me awake. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When morning finally came, I almost didn't want to look outside. But I had to know. This time, the changes were more pronounced. My camping gear had been meticulously organized by size. Everything from my cookware to my first aid kit arranged in perfect rows on a fallen log. My trail map, which had been stuffed in my pack, was spread out on the ground with my current location circled in red. Most disturbing of all, my own hiking journal sat open on my camp chair, with a new entry written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Sleep well? I broke camp in record time, hands shaking as I stuffed gear into my pack. The main trail was only half a mile away. If I pushed hard, I could make it to the next shelter before dark. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice, I spun around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, but saw nothing. The shelter was occupied when I arrived, a retired couple doing a section hike. I nearly cried with relief at the sight of other people. They shared their dinner and asked no questions about why a solo hiker looked so spooked. That night, I slept in the shelter between the couple, feeling safer than I had in days. But when I woke up, my backpack had been moved outside. Everything inside had been unpacked and repacked, neater than I ever could have done it myself. My journal had another new entry. Don't worry, I'll take good care of your things. The couple was still sleeping soundly. Whoever had gone through my pack had managed to do it without waking any of us. I didn't stay for breakfast. The ranger station was 8 miles away, and I intended to reach it before noon. The trail felt different now. Every shadow concealed a potential threat, every overlook a possible vantage point for someone watching me. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back with each step. I set up my final camp just 2 miles from the ranger station. It was a reckless choice, born of exhaustion and the false security of being close to civilization. I convinced myself that one more night was all I needed to endure. The sound that woke me was subtle, the slow, deliberate slide of my tent's zipper being pulled up, the kind of sound someone makes when they're trying very hard to be quiet. My flashlight was in my hand, but I couldn't make myself turn it on. The zipper continued its upward journey, inch by excruciating inch. A cold breeze hit my face as the tent door opened. In the dim moonlight filtering through the nylon, I could make out a shadow bending down, reaching inside. That's when my paralysis broke. I slammed my hand against the tent wall and screamed as loudly as I could. The shadow disappeared. I heard rapid footsteps retreating into the woods, followed by an unnatural silence. With trembling hands, I turned on my flashlight and looked outside. All my gear was arranged in a perfect circle around my tent. In the center of my camp chair sat a single item, my camera, which I'd lost on the first day. I checked the memory card. There were new photos on it, dozens of them, all of me sleeping on different nights. The final image showed me from just moments ago, illuminated by moonlight, taken through the mesh of my tent door. I made it to the ranger station by sunrise. They organized a search but found nothing except a few scattered campgrounds with all the gear arranged in the same meticulous circles. No fingerprints, no footprints, no suspects. I sold most of my camping gear after that, keeping only my journal as a reminder. Sometimes I reread those entries written in the strange handwriting, trying to make sense of what happened. Last week, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me, sitting at my kitchen table, reading my hiking journal. On the back, in that familiar handwriting, "Miss our camping trips. We should do it again sometime." I've installed extra locks on my doors and windows, but at night, I still hear the slow, patient sound of a zipper being pulled up, inch by inch. The thing about bird calls is that they're supposed to fade into the natural rhythm of the forest. But when someone starts mimicking them back to you with increasing precision, getting closer with each exchange, you realize how easily a simple sound can become a hunter's tool. We learned that lesson too late. My sister Rachel, our friend Mike, and I were experienced hikers. We'd grown up exploring the mountains of northern Washington state, and this particular trail in the Olympic National Forest was practically our backyard. The plan was simple: a 3-day loop through some of the more remote sections, testing out our new ultralight gear before a longer trek planned for later in the summer. Rachel had always been good with bird calls. It was her thing. She could identify dozens of species just by sound and mimic many of them perfectly. That first morning on the trail, she was in her element, exchanging calls with a varied thrush somewhere in the canopy above us. "Listen to this one," she said, letting out a perfect series of descending whistles. We waited, and sure enough, the thrush responded with an identical pattern, except it wasn't quite identical. Mike noticed it first. "That's weird," he said, stopping on the trail. The response came from much lower than the original bird. Rachel tried again, this time with a different pattern. The response was immediate and perfect. Too perfect. Like someone had recorded her call and played it back. And it was definitely closer to ground level. Probably just the acoustics of the valley, I suggested. But there was something unsettling about it. We kept hiking, and Rachel, ever curious, continued her bird call exchanges. By early afternoon, we'd covered about 8 miles, and the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every time Rachel made a call, it was echoed back with increasing precision, and always from a position closer to the trail. What started as responses from 100 yards away were now coming from just 50 feet into the forest. "Maybe we should stop with the bird calls," Mike suggested, his voice tense. Rachel nodded, finally seeming to grasp that something wasn't right. We hiked in silence for the next hour, but the damage was done. As we set up camp that evening, we heard it, a perfect imitation of Rachel's varied thrush call from earlier that morning. It came from the tree-line directly behind our campsite. "Hey!" Mike shouted into the growing darkness. "Who's out there?" The only response was another bird call, this time a Swainson's thrush that Rachel had mimicked around noon. It came from a different direction, closer to the trail we'd coming on. We gathered closer to the fire, speaking in whispers. "Someone's been following us all day," Rachel said, her earlier enthusiasm replaced with fear. "They've been learning my calls." "We should pack up and hike out," I suggested, but Mike shook his head. "It's too dark now. We'd be more vulnerable moving through the forest at night." A third call pierced the darkness, the distinctive sound of a hermit thrush, another of Rachel's favorites from that morning. This time it came from yet another direction. Whoever was out there was surrounding our camp. We took turns keeping watch that night, but the calls continued sporadically, moving around our position. Sometimes they'd overlap, suggesting multiple people, each one perfectly mimicking Rachel's unique variations on the bird songs. None of us slept. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we quickly packed up camp. That's when we heard it, Rachel's entire morning repertoire of bird calls, played back in sequence, coming from all around us. Our stalkers had learned every single variation. We abandoned the trail and headed straight downhill, hoping to reach the forest road we knew paralleled the valley about 2 miles below. The bird calls followed, using our own sounds to track our movement through the woods. Each call helped the others zero in on our location. "They're hurting us," Mike gasped as we crashed through the underbrush. He was right. Every time we tried to change direction, a perfectly mimicked bird call would sound directly in our path, forcing us to turn. We were being driven deeper into the forest, away from the road, away from help. The calls were so close now, we could hear the distinctly human breath behind them. These weren't recordings. These were people who had spent all day learning Rachel's calls, using her own voice against us. The forest ahead started to thin, and we burst into a small clearing. That's when we saw them. Dark figures standing at the edge of the trees, each wearing what looked like primitive hunting gear. They stepped forward in unison, still mimicking our bird calls, now mixed with something that sounded almost like laughter. Rachel screamed, and that finally broke their pattern. The figures froze, startled by this new sound they hadn't learned. We used that moment of confusion to break through their line, running blindly through the forest. By some miracle, we stumbled onto the forest road 20 minutes later. A passing Forest Service truck picked us up. But by the time rangers returned to investigate, they found nothing except some strange markings carved into trees around the clearing, crude symbols that looked like birds in flight. We later learned that several hikers had gone missing in that area over the years. Some were found wandering, severely dehydrated, claiming they'd been led astray by familiar voices calling from the woods. Others were never found at all. Rachel never made another bird call after that day. She says she can't shake the feeling that somewhere in those woods, someone is still practicing her voice, waiting to use it on the next group of unsuspecting hikers. I still hike those mountains, but never on that trail, and never where I can hear the birds too clearly. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I catch myself listening for familiar calls in the forest, wondering if they're really birds at all, or just echoes of someone else's lost voice, still being passed around by whatever hunts in those woods. Last week, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a hand-carved wooden whistle and a note that read, "We've mastered all your sister songs. Time to learn some new ones." I crushed the whistle immediately, but sometimes at night, I swear I can hear those same bird calls outside my window, getting closer with each response. The morning we found the first map pinned to a tree, Sarah laughed it off as a prank. By the fifth map, as we watched someone methodically track our movements through the campground, marking our location with surgical precision, we realized we weren't dealing with a prankster. Someone was hunting us. It started as a simple weekend getaway. Sarah and I had been dating for 6 months, and this was our first camping trip together at Lake Meriwether State Park. The late September weather was perfect. Warm days, cool nights, and most of the summer crowd had cleared out. We chose a secluded spot in Loop C, the furthest camping area from the main entrance. Setting up camp that first evening felt almost romantic. Sarah strung fairy lights around our tent while I got the fire going. We made s'mores, shared a bottle of wine, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and distant owls. Everything felt perfect. The map appeared sometime before dawn. I found it while gathering kindling for the morning fire. A detailed topographical map of the entire campground, printed on high-quality paper and carefully protected in a clear plastic sleeve. It was pinned to an oak tree facing our tent, our site marked with a precise red circle. "Look at this," I called to Sarah, who was still half asleep in her camp chair. "Someone's got way too much time on their hands." She examined the map, her expression turning serious. "Tyler, this isn't a standard park map. Look at the detail. It shows every campsite, every trail, even the maintenance roads that aren't on public maps." She was right. The map was far more detailed than anything available at the ranger station. Our site wasn't just marked. It was annotated with specific notes about our equipment, right down to the brand of our tent and the color of Sarah's car. We took the map to the camp host, an older man named Bill who seemed disturbed by what we showed him. "This isn't one of ours," he confirmed, studying the annotations. "I'll call it in to the rangers. Maybe move you folks to a different site." We relocated to Loop A, closer to the ranger station. It felt safer there, surrounded by other campers. We spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to shake off our unease. But when we returned to our new site that evening, another map was waiting. This one showed our relocation, with a red line trace from our original site to the new one. More disturbing were the timestamps marking our movements throughout the day, including our hiking route and every place we'd stop to rest or take photos. "We should leave," Sarah whispered, but something made us stay. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe we still weren't taking the threat seriously enough. We decided to stick it out one more night. The third map appeared before dinner, pinned to a different tree. The fourth showed up around midnight, and the fifth just before dawn. Each one tracked our movements with increasing detail, adding notes about our conversations, what we ate, even which direction our tent door was facing. By morning, the entire campground was covered in maps. They created a perfect timeline of our stay, marking every step we'd taken. Other campers found them too, all focused on our movements. The rangers swept the area but found nothing except more maps deeper in the woods, forming a circle around Loop A. We packed up quickly, throwing gear into Sarah's car while rangers watched the tree line. As we pulled out of the campground, a final map flooded onto our windshield, showing our exact planned route home, including the gas stations where we'd need to stop based on our fuel level. The rangers never found who was responsible. They discovered a small campsite in the woods, abandoned but full of surveying equipment, computers, and hundreds of blank maps. Everything was arranged with the same meticulous precision as the annotations that had tracked us. We thought it was over when we got home, but the maps kept coming. They appeared on our front doors, slipped under our windshield wipers, tucked into our mailboxes. Each one showed our daily routines in perfect detail. Where we worked when we left home, which coffee shops we visited. Sarah moved to Portland the next month, saying she needed a fresh start. The maps followed her there too. Last week, she called in tears, saying she'd found one pinned to her bedroom wall, inside her locked apartment on the 11th floor. I still find new maps every few days. They're tracking someone else now, a young couple who just moved into the apartment complex. I've tried warning them, but how do you tell someone they're being hunted by someone who sees everything, knows everything, maps everything? Yesterday, I found a blank map and a red pen on my kitchen table. On the back was a handwritten note. "Your turn to learn the art of observation." The pen was still warm, like someone had just set it down. Tonight, I'm sleeping in my car, driving random patterns through the city. But I know tomorrow morning, there will be a new map showing every turn, every stop, every moment of hesitation. Somewhere out there, someone is watching, measuring, mapping, and I'm just another point on their endless survey of human movement. I've started making my own maps, trying to find patterns in the observer's behavior. Sometimes I think I'm getting close to understanding their methodology. Other times, I wonder if that's exactly what they want. Teaching me their art, grooming me to become another mapper, another watcher in their endless pursuit of human patterns. Sarah called again this morning. She found a map of my apartment on her desk, every detail perfect despite her never having visited. Below our original campsite, a small note read, "Where it all began, where it all returns." I'm heading back to Lake Meriwether tomorrow. This time, I'm bringing my own maps. When you find photos of your campsite weeks before you set up your tent there, you start questioning everything you know about time, reality, and what it means to be watched. The timestamps don't lie. Someone had been photographing our future campsite for months, waiting for us to arrive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the day we found those photos. Lisa, Jake, and I were 3 days into our week-long trek to the Cascade Mountains. We'd planned this trip meticulously, marking potential campsites on our maps and carefully weighing each piece of gear. What we hadn't planned for was finding evidence that our arrival had been anticipated long before we'd even decided to come. The site we chose that evening was perfect. A small clearing near Alpine Lake, sheltered by ancient cedars and offering stunning views of the surrounding peaks. As we set up camp, Lisa was scrolling through a local hiking group's Facebook page, looking for trail conditions ahead. "Hey guys," her voice had an odd edge to it. "Come look at this." She turned her phone screen toward us. There, posted 6 weeks earlier, was a photo of our campsite. Empty, waiting. The caption read, "Perfect spot for 3. They'll love the view." "Weird coincidence," Jake said, but he was already pulling out his own phone, scrolling through the same group's photos. We found more. Dozens more. The same site, photographed from different angles over the past 3 months. Some shots were taken at dawn, others at dusk. Many focused on the exact spots where we just placed our tents. The most recent photo had been posted just yesterday, showing the site still empty with the caption, "Almost time." "Check the user profile," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The account was named Waiting Watcher, created 6 months ago with no personal information. Every post was a photo of what would become our campsite, each caption more specific than the last. 2 months ago, "They'll put the blue tent there." 1 month ago, "The woman will sleep closest to the lake." Last week, 3 friends, 3 tents, 3 days from now. Jake immediately started packing up his gear. "We're not staying here." "Wait," Lisa said, still scrolling. "Look at these comments." Under each photo were bizarre conversations between Waiting Watcher and other accounts. They discussed us in detail, our hiking experience, our gear preferences, even our personal lives. Information that couldn't possibly have been known months ago. "How do they know my tent is blue?" I whispered. "I just bought it last week." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the trees. We were at least 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, and navigating the rocky terrain in darkness would be dangerous. "We should stay," Lisa argued. "We're already here, and we're together. Safety in numbers." As if in response to her words, a notification popped up on her phone. A new photo had just been posted to the hiking group, our campsite, taken from the Treeline, showing the 3 of us huddled around her phone. The timestamp read, "Just now." We spun toward the woods, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. Nothing moved except shadows and wind-stirred branches. Jake started setting up a watch rotation. None of us would sleep alone tonight. As we gathered firewood, more photos appeared in the group, each one showing us from different angles, always just moments after they were taken. "They're toying with us," Lisa muttered, her hands shaking as she checked her phone again. Around midnight, the photos stopped. The silence felt worse somehow. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. During my shift, I scrolled through all the old photos, looking for clues. That's when I noticed something in the background of shots taken months ago. 3 indistinct figures watching the empty campsite from the shadows. In each successive photo, they moved closer. Dawn brought no relief. We found cameras tied to tree branches all around our site. Not modern digital cameras, but old Polaroids. Each one was loaded with film but hadn't been fired. Waiting. As we packed up to leave, the cameras started clicking one by one, capturing our departure. Photos developed and dropped to the forest floor, creating a trail of images documenting our retreat. Back at the trailhead, we reported everything to the rangers. They searched the area but found only empty camera mounts and a journal filled with detailed notes about our expected arrival. The final entry read, "Performance documented. Subjects moving to next site." We thought it was over when we got home. Then Lisa found an album on her doorstep, filled with photos of empty rooms in her house, taken over the past month. Jake discovered his entire Instagram account had been tagged in hundreds of photos of his daily routine, all posted months before they were taken. I stopped using social media after finding my own future mapped out in carefully composed shots. But the photos keep appearing. Under my door, in my mailbox, taped to my window. Always empty scenes of places I'm about to be. Yesterday, I received a package containing a Polaroid camera and a note. "Your turn to wait and watch. Choose your subjects carefully. Sometimes I catch myself studying empty spaces now, imagining who might fill them. I've started seeing the world through a photographer's eye, compositions waiting for their subjects to arrive. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder if I'm becoming like them, a watcher, a waiter, a documenter of moments that haven't happened yet. The latest photo arrived this morning. An empty chair in an empty room. My living room. The caption reads, "You'll understand when you sit down to write about us tomorrow." I'm sitting in that chair now, writing this story. The Polaroid sits on my desk, loaded and ready. Through my window, I can see a perfect composition forming. 3 hikers approaching a campsite, unaware they've been expected for months. Maybe I'll take the shot. Maybe I already have.